is Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs. I want to digress here. That's the job John Taylor had a few years ago.
Exactly right. Tom, it's good to be on. Very nice to see you.
Would John Taylor make a good Fed chairman? I mean, he's got the international experience that you have now.
Yes, he would, and others are. There are other candidates, and the important thing is for there to be more growth. You know, as you think about the Fed, it's gone through a giant transformation of its balance sheet.
Right.
So one of the hardest challenges going forward is how do you find a way through that that creates and allows more growth? Small business growth. Can I get that in right at the top?
Would it be a Malpass interview if we didn't get small business in there right at the top? Right now, at these meetings, the theme is, okay, things are better, but in every dinner, every lunch, it's but to move growth forward. What's the but for you in the Trump administration to move global growth forward?
Secretary Mnuchin is the head of our delegation here. He sat last night with Janet Yellen at the dinner, and Secretary Mnuchin has been emphasizing tax reform as a critical spot for U.S. growth to push forward, regulatory reforms, and then we're taking that message to the world, really, and making the point that it benefits us if everyone grows. And while there is an acceleration of the world, Christine Lagarde talked about that last night, it's not enough yet. We'd like to see more growth both in the U.S. and abroad. Mario Draghi talked about the breadth of growth in Europe and how do you keep that sustained? How do you make that go forward? Minister Jaitley of India made the point that India has gone through two very difficult structural reforms, their demonetization and their GST tax change that they've done, and now they get some benefits from those structural reforms.
At that dinner last night, I believe they had Secretary Mnuchin sit separately from Madame Lagarde, and of course there's this uproar over tax reform and what the IMF should be. Sam Fleming had this in the FT. Give us new insight on what the Trump administration would like from the IMF, where the IMF has a responsibility to look at tax reform under Article 4.
You know, this really is an economists against economists kind of a debate. So there is, and has been for decades, the issue that some economists think that higher tax rates is good for the world because you're able to distribute money to people through that mechanism. And others think, wait a minute, we ought to have a low rate on a broad base, and that's going to allow the private sector to do well. So that confrontation goes on in the IMF. As it goes into foreign countries, it's often putting, I think, too much emphasis on more taxes.
But then to follow on, and this goes to your wonderful analysis of debt and deficit over the decades you were at Bear Stearns, the distinction here is you move from tax reform to fiscal policy. Douglas Holtz-Eakin told us on Bloomberg Surveillance, former head of the CBO, and I would suggest someone sympathetic to Malpass economics. Dr. Holtz-Eakin said we have a vector of deficit to GDP that could be 5% or 6%, or heaven forbid, he said 7%. We can't allow that to happen. How can we have Trump tax reform and fiscal responsibility at the same time?
I don't think that's exactly the right question. The question should be our current tax code doesn't work. It simply blocks growth.
All agree on that. Fair.
That has to be fixed. And then separately, you can say, and our spending policies really need to be reformed from the ground up. There needs to be a budget process that works, a debt limit that works. There needs to be restraint by politicians and on down the line. And that's something the Trump administration can work on, but don't put that together with the tax reform.
So you don't want to combine a tax reform analysis with a fiscal policy analysis?
I think the critical thing is to get the tax reform done early so that people can begin investing and hiring. The critical goal, remember, from the beginning of the Trump campaign was how do you get more people employed, the participation rate to go higher, and get average wages to go up. So every time people are talking about policy, that's the context.
You and Kevin Hassett are frontline economists. Do you have a voice within the administration? Are you spending your time jetting around the world? I hope not on private jets. You're on something more cost affordable, unlike these other secretaries. But are you jetting around internationally, or do you and Hassett have a voice within the administration?
So, you know, I'm going to Asia, and I'll be flying back economy class.
Malpass is too tall to fly economy.
Tell my doctor that.
I'll tell Secretary Mnuchin that you are too tall to go economy.
You know, we're for one, on trying to save money wherever we can, trying to be restrained in our own view of what the world can, of what governments can do within the world. Liberating the private sector is the highest priority, and that means downsizing a lot of the work streams. So I've made 2 trips so far, but mostly I'm working in the administration to find a way to have policies oriented toward American workers. That's and I know that sounds cliche, except that actually is what's going on every day in the government.
You have one of the most important jobs in economics in the world as Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs. You and I know the courage and exhaustion John Taylor faced after September 11th with his public service on these important issues. Maybe it's not as urgent now, but the fact is you've got to worry about Sweden and India and cashless societies, and you have to worry about illegal corruption and crime in our Treasury flows. What have you learned about what we're doing, first of all, about cybersecurity, corruption, and crime in our finance system?
Those were talked about substantially yesterday. Christine Lagarde quoted John F. Kennedy saying, when it's not raining, fix your roof. And so there was a lot of that going on. People are trying to reach around, and there were private sector people involved yesterday, financial institutions talking about their cybersecurity programs and how the U.S., how governments around the world could help with that effort to stop both the corruption, the crime, the terrorism. And Treasury has a big, and Secretary Mnuchin pointed out yesterday, he's spending a large portion of his time on the counterterrorism efforts, the sanctions efforts. One of the discussions yesterday was about Venezuela, where the people aren't free, and where and so there's a big world effort to say, how do we get everyone growing better?
My book of the year last year, Ken Rogoff, on cash and on corruption in cash. Sweden is providing leadership on this issue. India's had the courage under huge uproar. India has the courage to address this. Does the Trump administration have the courage to go after cash in suitcases?
There's huge courage, and yes, absolutely, cash in suitcases, meaning illicit funds. There is a giant, I would say, all fronts effort within the government to stop that because of the security of Americans. That's the highest priority along with jobs, and so you can do that by applying people. I'm having meetings all day, yesterday, today, and tomorrow on that touch on the G7 meeting yesterday, which is the group of 7 finance ministers and central bank heads from the 7 major economies, had a long session both on cybersecurity and on sanctions. North Korea is an obvious big challenge that people are talking about at these meetings today and tomorrow.